Layers, we talked about this just a moment ago. I use a distinctive layering system and organization. I think I'm probably not alone in this, but basically I like to have one variable called layer or layers that contains references to all of the display groups that I'm going to be using, and then I can basically store those groups in a field on the parent group, and then I insert those child groups into the parent group to get this layering. So display current stage is the top level group created by Corona, and it contains layers, which is not shown in this hierarchy. And then under layers is underlay, content, and overlay, where underlay is at the bottom, content is in the middle, and overlay is on top of everything else. And so by having this very simple structure, I can insert content into any of these groups and know that it will either be above or below other content. For example, the underlay, I would insert typically a background image that I didn't want to move around, and then if I inserted items into content, they will always be in front of that background image, which is an underlay. And similarly, overlay I use typically for interface things like labels and buttons and things that must be on top of everything else. Alright, as in episode 1, this bit of the code hasn't changed. I created a blue background which I put into underlay, so it's always going to be underneath everything else. And then 4, which we're going to come back to in just a moment, I build the level. So all of the magic happens in these few lines of code. Of course, there are many more lines of code that are called because of this, but the basic structure of this is very simple and easy to follow. But moving on, just before we come back, 5, I create the inputs, the buttons, by calling the create function on the inputs module. And then 6, 7, and 8, 6 and 7 are basically, I created some indicators here. I created a coin counter and a level indicator that will be updated by our code to show us how many coins we've picked up and what level we are currently on. 8 is me tracking what current level we're on. So whenever this function gets called, the file level variable current level is set to level num, which is passed in the create function right here, which we called from main. So for example, if I put in 2 in main just to test it, I reloaded this, our level indicator would show 2, and current level, the file level visible variable, would have 2 in it, which is important. Go ahead.
I've noticed in your projects that you tend to do that from like a speed of development or speed of testing. You tend to do things like that, like being able to turn off the initial splash screen, or being able to turn off the initial menu and be able to get right into the game, or be able to jump.
I'm a big fan of things that speed up development and prototyping, and having flags for turning on and off features so that I can sort of like minimize the problem set that I'm trying. Usually what will happen is I'm doing development and I run into a bug or something, and if you leave everything turned on, then you could have a real problem debugging. But if you know that I've got the debug code turned on, but I don't have any of the fancy animation code, or I've turned off, for example, if I went into common and I said don't load the dangers and don't load the others, I was trying to track down some problem that had to do with, say, gravity or something, then I know that these things are not interacting because they're not even being loaded. So I think that's what you were talking to.
Yeah. I think those are good things to take note of, and good tips, because I think, at least for myself, I know when I start down the road of looking at a project, I'm like, okay, well, I'm just trying to solve the question of how do I make these things do this into a whole game, right? So you don't look at it from a perspective of I want to be able to turn these things on and off, because that's really not.
Yeah, that's not. It actually,
part of the game.
In a sense, it makes it more complicated because you've got to think ahead.
Right.
But once you get into the practice of having the ability to enable or disable parts of your game, you'll find that it's very useful for developing and debugging. another thing is sometimes when you're developing a game, like this one is pretty simple. It started out really simple. It was just squares and circles and squares and circles. But it started to kind of get more and more stuff on it now. So if I only want to deal with debugging and coding that one bit, having the ability to turn off all the other parts really helps simplify the problem at hand.
Yeah, I know. I'm thinking specifically right now. Kevin's on the panel, and he's got a game that he's working on. It's got 60 different levels to it. So I'm thinking it would be good to be able to jump into level 59, like right from the beginning.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Oh, I sorry. You were pointing that out too. Yes, exactly. I always have cheat entry points so that I can go to any specific level or part of a level that I want to debug. I've got zero patience for having to play my own games to test features that are somewhere off in another part of a level, or like this one's really simple. It's a very small level, but you can imagine a game that's very broad, very tall, like some kind of a platformer. For example, I developed side topic a game a few months back that was an endless runner style game where it got progressively harder as you went along, and more enemy elements came in and obstacles and stuff. And there was no way I was going to play it out to level 60 to test the level 60 elements every time.
Yeah.
So I could just crank it up to level 59 and then play up into level 60 and say, okay, yeah, that's working. At least I feel fairly confident that that transition worked and that the element pieces that I thought should be there are there. I mean, there's always other things that can go wrong, but yeah, for anybody listening, don't play your games all the way through every time. I mean, it's good once or twice, but if you're trying to get it done sometime this year, you need shortcuts into sub-levels and etc.
It's like a video editing. If you have a piece of music that you're going to use in your video, you always save it to last, because otherwise you're going to hate that piece of music by the time you're done editing everything.
Absolutely, and that's also why I have these debug features in here where we started off with just circles and squares, because I didn't care about animations and I didn't care about having the right color or something like that. I just wanted to make sure the basics worked. So start simple, add complexity only after you're sure that the game fundamentals are working. Because if you add all the complex, I see a lot of new developers do this. They go in and they go, oh, it'd be really cool to have this animation, the particle effects, and they get all these like cool looking things, and they get all caught up in that, but the core part of their game either isn't any fun or it doesn't work. So, and I'm sure we've all seen that with people asking questions in the forums, where they'll get way ahead of their knowledge level and comfort level with the code and get stuck because they got sidetracked by something else.
Yeah.
So speaking